What's up, guys? This is Jordan Nothing Gilbert.
This is another episode of Reflections, and I'm here with Bullseye, a really old school player from the Counter-Strike days. So I always, I like to start interviews chronologically, you go back to the beginning. So we're going back pretty far here, Bullseye. We're legit going back like 17 years, beginning of Counter-Strike, basically. Now, I know a lot of the players who were in your peer group were the guys who started literally with Beta 1. I mean, if anyone remembers, K-Sharp had like the most ridiculous one ID ever. I think it was like Leet or like 1335 or something, something really insane like that. So were you one of the guys who actually started in Beta 1 of Counter-Strike? Did you get in early?
I didn't start in Beta 1. I actually started in Beta 3. I used to play Quake and Team Fortress a lot, and then I found Counter-Strike in Beta 3. Kind of just never looked back. That was a long time ago.
So I remember in the early days of the NA scene, the key development was when these two teams came along. One was called CK3, Clan Killers 3. One was called NHG. And these two teams were like the rivals, and just to give people context, because this is in the really early days of Counter-Strike, actually it was like 7v7, and it wasn't even like max rounds necessarily. I think you played like 20 minutes a half or something crazy, And so these teams, though, the key thing is, sure, there's some names that if I showed people, no one would know them. Some of them never made it past that. But within those teams, there's a lot of the names that were dominant for the next few years, a lot of the people who obviously became your teammates. So what was the order? Were you actually in the NHG team first and then CK3? It was something like that. I know there was a lot of players went between the two, right?
No, I was just in CK3. I went from a small team straight to CK3 with K-Sharp, and I think Rambo was in it. Maybe
at some point. No, he was in Syndicate. He was in Riot Squad. Yeah,
that's right.
It was X3. You guys had team. Okay, so one of the interesting things is, one of the first ever CPLs, it wasn't actually like an official CPL, it just had CS at it as well, was the Speakeasy CPL. Yeah. And the thing about this was, at the time, that's why it's weird. It wasn't like there was a huge attention on it, but they had a tournament. Funnily enough, it was won by basically what became later NIP, it was Potty, some of those guys. Mm-hmm. And at this tournament, it was one of your first big lands, essentially, right? You went with the CK3 team, it was you, I think it was Kyle as well, right? It just wasn't Big Dog, right? Was that correct? Have I got it right way around? Or is it the other way? I think Kyle was there as well, though.
I think Kyle was there. I think Big Dog was there. So CK3 actually had two teams at CPL, if I remember. And then after that event is when we formed X3. But yeah, Rambo wasn't there.
He was on Syndicate, yeah.
I can't even remember.
The Riot Squad guys.
Yeah, I can't remember who was on that CK3 team now that I think about it.
Well, this ties into the question then. So one of the things about that team was, most of the players who became X3, which became the dominant team in North America for the next few years, were on this team. It's just like I said, not only was it 7v7, but you can imagine, if you want to do 7v7 games, you can't just have 7 members in. You're going to need like 10, so people can be free to play. So these teams back then, they were huge. There was a lot of members in them, and the idea is you'd rotate people in and out, depending on where you played. But one of the interesting things was, those teams actually, I remember, did have tactics and stuff. A lot of them were, at the time, the average age of the gamer, was a bit older. They tried to sort of have real tactics. But the problem with that was there was a lot of players who maybe could get by in the early days who weren't actually that skilled. They were just like, they were like a 26-year-old guy. Well, back then that was old to us, obviously. They were like a 26-year-old guy and they would just play in their part-time or whatever. So when you made X3, it's fair to say, right, that you basically just got all the best players and made a real competitive team.
Oh, yeah. X3 was... It was basically CK3 ended it, and we made a good run that tournament. I think we got second, maybe. I can't remember. But we made X3 with the pure purpose of winning tournaments. I mean, it was K-Sharp, Rambo, me.
Moto originally, but then it became your old mate Chameleon.
Chameleon, yeah. And Kane was in there towards the 3D side, actually.
3D, yeah.
Yeah. Moto came in from 3D. But yeah, we wanted the best from North America all to get together so that we could compete against the Europeans, and that's what we did.
Okay, so I remember when you made this team, as I'm kind of pointing out there, it really was just like trying to put the best players together, and the point is to win the big tournaments,
Mm-hmm.
One of the early things that's interesting, because it'll tie back in later in the story, is Moto was on X3, and he was a member, and just like all the others, and you won an early tournament, you won let me think which one it was that you won.
We won a CPL.
Oh, it was Speakeasy that you won with them. I think of Babbage's was the one I thought of before. It was Speakeasy that you won together. And then what happened was there was a split in the team where I mean, I remember Ray, Big Dog, once described it to me as like, no, what happened was we all had no leaders, okay? You know, it was a team of like good players and everyone's supposed to just do their job. And basically Moto was like, there should be a leader and it should be me. And then everyone was like, well, we don't want leaders, so you can go, you can leave basically. And he went off, and obviously he was in like the rival team, he was in Domain of Pain. Then later on he made his TSO team, and he tried basically to go down the leadership route, to be the in-game leader, have tactics. Now it'll sound crazy to people now, the idea that teams would play without really set tactics and, you know, do a lot of in-depth practice. But back then, especially in the early versions, you could get by a bit on individual skill if you had enough good players, right?
Yeah, our tactics basically were go left. You know, go middle, right? Because you got K Sharp, who's you know, just sniping people at will, and you got Rambo, and you got Big Dog, and myself, and Ronald, and pretty much everybody on that team was a fragger, right? I mean, there was, it's just go and kill, and it was fun. I mean, we would joke around in comms, we would play music, we would talk about stuff that wasn't even related to the games we were playing, but then it got to a point where the Europeans were so dominant that we were like, all right, we probably need some tactics. And I think that's when Moto came back and we formed 3D.
Yeah, so here's the interesting part, though, is obviously the big clash everyone still remembers of X3 was this CPL. It was in the winter of 2001. It was the first real big tournament. You know, before that, all the tournaments were like, they were never, you know, it's not like the top 10 teams in the whole world went to one tournament before this. You know, you'd have a couple of Europeans, or if it was in Europe, you know, it'd be just only Europeans. So the key thing about this was, if you were setting it up, it really was like a movie, you know, like you guys dominated NA, and everyone who's an NA fan obviously would be like, they'd win the championship if they played. In Europe, NIP won everything, and same thing, you know, European fans were like, nah, but if they played, they'd beat X3. Right. Not only did you go to this tournament, which was, like I say, all the best teams, it was big prize money, but you even did meet in the final. You had the big matches against each other, and they were crazy games, right?
Mm-hmm. They were. If I remember right, we had to win. I think we came up through the losers brackets. We had just lost them, so we had to beat them 2 out of 3, and I think we took it down to the wire, if I remember.
Yeah, I think the first game was the one you won. I think that was the overtime, and then you lost one, like, you know, minimum amount of rounds possible.
Yeah. It was definitely a crazy game, and almost kind of set up the next few years with. I mean, we played them over and over. They just different name changes.
So back in the day then, one of the weird things about the early days of CS is the fact that if someone's from Sweden, you might get, like at that point, I think I was like the second time you might have ever played some of these guys. Not like you played every month, every week, like, you know, teams do nowadays.
Right.
Was it difficult to play against someone that you might have never played, or you'd only played once before, and then you have to face whatever form they're in now? Was it tough to play like that?
Yeah, I mean, we also didn't have, you know, there wasn't the Twitch scouting and everything that's out there now with availability to know what they're going to do. Yeah, I mean, it was basically just we see them twice a year maybe, and we know it's going to be a crazy game, but we have no idea what to expect. Yeah, the Europeans definitely played a different style than the Americans back then. So
once the X3 team split up and you went and you made 3D, it's because at the time, you know, we'd had a few years in CS, but in the story of CS as a whole, that's like chapter 1 at the very, very beginning. So no one will remember some of the players who didn't go on from that. So a player I want to ask you about is Big Dog, a guy who Texas native, played in all the early tournaments, you know, a lot of the early teams. And the problem is, since the most famous game for X3 was this NIP game, unfortunately, I remember him telling me the stories, like, this was like the worst game he ever had, basically. He just got wrecked every time outside by Potty. It was pretty fucking good. And the problem is, that's going to make people think, oh, was he like the worst player in the team or something? Like, I think Midway even wrote an article where he implied as much. But from when I've talked to players back in the day, I remember the early days. What was Big Dog like as a player? He was one of the good players, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's a laid-back kid, and he was accurate with his weapons. He was a fragger. I mean, he's a really good player. But yeah, he had a rough game that game, and you know, NIP took advantage of it. But yeah, he was bummed out. I don't know for how long. He kind of just disappeared from the scene. Yeah, I have no idea what he's doing now, but. So I'm sure he'll live with that one forever.
Believe me, man, I met him years later. If when I brought it up, you know, all the stories came out again. Oh, it's bullshit. You know, you just picked me and I was dead. It's like instantly he was back there. You know, it's like sports. You know, when people lose the big game, they're always going to think about it, right? So when you made this team 3D,
Yeah.
Like, one of the interesting things about it is everyone at the time just looked at the lineup and the fact you have good players and you have some of the newer players. But one of the key details of this actually was the point of making 3D was actually to try and be like the European teams, to have a professional team, so Torborg was going to be the manager. He's going to try and find sponsorships. And this is a big deal because X3, you'll notice in the storyline here, it's all NA tournaments you play at. And in fact, most of you lived in Texas, so you just drive to the tournament. You know, there's no real sponsorships needed at the time. So NA was quite far behind at that time, right? You needed to sort of go towards some sort of professional model if you're going to be pro gamers.
Sure. Yeah, I think I still like to think as 3D is the pioneer for it all, but who knows? I mean, everyone probably has their own version of it. But yeah, 3D was the pure purpose was to make a living and make this our jobs and our careers. And it worked. I mean, we went to Europe a lot. We went to South Korea. It was fun. I think we picked up NVIDIA and CompUSA and a couple others right off the bat. But yeah, Craig put that one all together. He kind of rounded us up.
Okay, so the first lineup of 3D was the one where you had DeBears and Jaden. And this was an interesting lineup in as much as, at the time, those were like, rising talents. They looked like they were pretty skilled players, and here's the key setup for everyone, is at the time, Counter-Strike used to be a lot more individually skilled around that time. And so, like I said, X3 could play without tactics. And if you just had the 5 best players, you really could win all the games, basically. I mean, there was seasons of Cal Invite you were just undefeated, or maybe DOP could win like 1 game ever, and still wouldn't win the season. But this team, I remember, was very shocking because online, it looked like the same thing. Everything's going great. DeBears is playing great. Jaden's fitting in the team. But you went to this CPL, and you guys are used to winning the CPL or top 4, Like I said, back then, the skill difference was so much that a bad day would be like a top 4 finish for a team like this. But this was a very shocking one because you didn't even make top 16. You got really upset. You lost to this team from Australia, F0, who did the weird cobble smokes that they knew over the top of the wall that no one knew about at the time. So fair play, they invented that. Then you lost to the Germans, MTW. And I remember after this, very quickly after is when you broke the team up, you got Moto and you got Kane from TSO, who were one of the better teams as well. Was it shocking to you to go to a CPL and basically just get wrecked early?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Because, like you said, we were so used to being the dominant force, especially in the American scene. I mean, teams, esports was growing. Teams came to play. They came with tactics. They came with stuff we had never seen before, and that was kind of the point where we realized we can't keep playing like this is like it's a 5 individuals game. We had to figure out some tactics and work on our teamwork for sure. And Moto brought that in. I think Kane joined because he was a buddy of Moto, so I think it was basically like a package deal, if I remember.
Yeah. Those were like the 2 best players in the other team they were in.
Yeah, and then we brought Steele in, who was he's just a really good, solid player. So that was kind of our 6th, and we had a 6-man rotation for 5 people game. But yeah, I mean, Moto came in, and we would work on strats every single night, work on nade positioning and all kind of stuff, and that's really how 3D kind of started rolling. Was once we started doing that.
So this was also the first tournament ever where a phenomenon was observed in the community. Okay, it would later go on to be infamous. It was called the DeBears CPL curse. Now, every year DeBears would be on a good team. He'd be on teams that online were very good, or even at other lands they could always do well. But somehow, it literally took something like 5 years. Every CPL, he got his heart broken. Something went wrong. You remember this?
Yeah, I mean, I love DeBears. He's a good guy, but back then he was pretty hyper, so I'm sure he took things pretty hard.
He's kind of a wild guy. Like I think I remember actually Steele, because obviously back then teams used to go a week before CPL and boot camp and stuff. And I remember when Steele was on the Gamers X team and he boot camped with a bunch of these other guys, Tech, etc., at these CPLs. And he told me a story like DeBears turned up he was going to play a week-long boot camp. He's going to play a week-long CPL. So he's going for 2 weeks. And he told me like he turned up with like $10 or something. Just like, well, see how I get through this. It's just like, kind of shows you the difference in professionalism back then.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, things were a lot different back then. We'd have to find a place to stay and somebody's house to stay at. It's totally different these days, but it was good times. I can see DeBears doing that.
Okay. What was Moto like as a player? Because the funny thing is, when I first got to know him was when he was in this TSO team. That was like, he'd separated from you guys. And whether or not you guys cared, because you were winning, you were doing well, he was a little bit bitter about it at the time, you know. Like, he was always like, part of what he was trying to do in that other team was like, I'm going to show those guys, like, you know, how important tactics are and how, you know, if you do this the right way, it's the better. So I think when you brought him back in, I think that was like a key moment for him, because he felt like, you know, you'd come around to his way of thinking and everyone was on the same page. So what was he like as an in-game leader?
Moto was a good leader. He wasn't harsh. Like, he wouldn't yell at people, but he demanded respect and the things that he was trying to do that we executed them well. I mean, that's the best way I can explain it. Like, he wouldn't get mad, but he just expected us to be solid and know where we're supposed to be. And I think we kind of just followed his example and just kind of took on, you know, executing correctly and timing of strats, and it just became easy. I mean, it became like, you know, just part of playing the game. He was a very good leader.
At the CPL I described, where you were there with the Bears and Jaden, you didn't do very well. This was actually the start of the trend where it's not just like, you know, Europe has an amazing team, America has an amazing team, you know, we go like 1-1 like that, like alternating. This was the trend where it started to be like it was mainly going to be European teams at the top. And the key thing was, obviously, 3D kind of stood out in as much as you could compete with them. In fact, at the next CPL, you beat them. You won the CPL Winter 2002. Aside from winning it, like, did you notice a trend where, for some reason, especially the Swedish teams, it's like they wouldn't just have one, you know, they'd have 2 or 3 teams that would be potential top 4 finishers, right?
Right. I like to think of the reason for that as being that they could afford that lifestyle, and they were American esports. It might even still be today. It's just not as organized as it is in the European scene, and it's not as much of a focus, I guess. You know, because they'll all get together and they'll land, you know, as much as possible. It's certainly a lot more than we used to. Whereas we would just practice online, then we'd show up for the event and hope for the best. I think the Europeans take professional sports, esports, a little higher than we do as far as what they expect.
When you won this CPL, it was the one where you got to beat, I mean, they were SK at the time, but it was the NIP guys, essentially, some of those guys. You got to rematch them. You even played them on Nuke, so that had to be a pretty cool revenge game.
That CPL, we beat Gold, didn't we?
In the final, yeah, but before that, you beat SK in the upper bracket.
Yeah. You know what? Ironically, that match doesn't stand out to me. It's the championship that does from that event.
Yeah.
Which that event, I think, who was the goal guy? Method? Is that the big guy?
Oh, right. You mean the manager?
I don't remember. But those goal guys were tearing it up that CPL, so I knew it was going to be a hard fight. But, like, I think the reason that one sticks out is because there's so many really well done movies about that event that are fun to watch from time to time. But it was a crazy match. It was almost like a redemption match for us, I think.
Okay. Yeah, if anyone wants to watch a movie about that tournament, by the way, there's a very famous one called Electronic Warfare, which mixes, like, you know, out of the game reactions with, like, actual in-game kills. And so you can see this match we're talking about here. It has, like, an extended sequence on it for any history buff who wants to go back and look at it. So the key thing is, Team3D not only, like, won the tournament, you know, was on top, but as we described with 3D, you had the salaries now, and you had the professional environment, and everyone was playing professionally full-time. How did it actually sit with you, going from being someone who played like as a hobby, or maybe if you have time off work you play, you know, to like it's just your job? Was it a difficult transition? Was it weird?
It's not a difficult transition. I think it's like any other sport or any other activity. When it becomes your livelihood and your job, then it really does become a job. I mean, you still enjoy it, but then you're setting a nightly schedule of practices and you're practicing all day long. It's just a different vibe when you play games pro. I mean, it's totally different.
Yeah.
I wouldn't trade it for the world, but it's, at least back then when the salaries were low and you still having to worry if you can pay your rent. It's definitely it was an interesting lifestyle.
In your team, you obviously had like a very different group of personalities. You know, a lot of them weren't even just like the standard nerd player. You know, I guess obviously K-Sharp and Ronald to some degree, Rambo, were kind of just the nerds, you know, played CS, played every other game, played World of Warcraft. In fact, that's one of the things I wanted to ask about. So famously, European teams used to literally describe like World of Warcraft, EverQuest. They would literally say like these games are like crack. Like if a player starts playing, you have to kick him basically because he's just going to go off into that world. He's going to ruin his life, you know. And as a pro, famously, you'll never come back from it. You know, you'll start playing that game too much. Was it tough in your teams? Because I know sometimes, like, yeah, you practice like the scrims, but I remember famously, Ronald once told me a story, Rambo. Like, I asked him after he's finished his CS career, like, Dota 2 had come out. And I said, oh, you must be loving that, Ronald. I know you love Dota. And he told me, like, no, I can't play it. And I was like, what do you mean? And he goes, well, I played so much Dota during my CS career that I'm actually just really bored of it. Like, I can't play it. And I was like, so while you were a pro CS player, you played, like, a billion hours of Dota? And he was like, yeah, I was quite lazy, basically. What was your team like in terms of the dedication? That was one of the 3Ds, remember?
Oh yeah, it was one of the 3Ds. I mean, it would stuff like that would crop up every once in a while, but it was never a major issue. You know, when World of Warcraft came out, we were all playing that, or there was an online poker phase that hit us all for a while, but it'd be like maybe one or two nights during the practice week where someone would say, I don't feel like playing, but they would still show up and play. I mean, it really never caused any kind of rift that I can recall.
So one of the strange things about the early days of the pro scene is that there weren't that many big tournaments. Like, you know, some of the years there might have only been 2 or 3, and then even as we went forward, you know, there may be like 4 or 5 big ones you had to go to. And so a lot of it was, the day-to-day stuff was online games. It was Cal invite matches, or it was, you know, this sort of thing. And the problem was, first of all, there was no prize money on the line. It's just for, you know, bragging rights, whatever else. And then secondly, this is what I want to ask you about. There was people won't believe this to this day. There was no anti-cheat. And here's the thing, right? I'm sure a lot of those players were legit. There was a lot of very good players. Some of them were just good online, weren't good offline. That's a good excuse. But some people probably cheated in some of these matches, right, Bullseye?
Well, all right. In Beta 3, I used Ronald McDonald skins. I'll come clean. Back in Beta 3 so I could see the enemies better. But I'm sure there were. But I think cheating became a lot more rampant after those days, at least from what I can tell from like wall hacks. And you read stuff on articles now where Overwatch players are getting banned or whatever. I didn't think it was that bad back then. I mean, it might have been, and it just never really came up or noticed. But I think Punk Busters started coming up during those days. Whether it was working or not, I don't know. I mean, we always won the online leagues, so if people were cheating against us, then it was just making us work harder because we never noticed. I mean, we never said, "Oh, that guy's cheating." And I know none of our guys were cheating because we would show up on LAN and do it. So
sure.
But I think cheating today is worse than it was back then. But that's just my opinion.
So one of the problems in the NA scene was, okay, you guys were in a great position. You had a professional org and real sponsors. But once you got beyond your team, most of the teams were like the old X3 team were, you know, like they were good players, or they could go to a LAN if they were nearby, or they could drive there. But a lot of them didn't have the professional setup. And so while on that level, I can understand why they wouldn't be super dedicated. You know, it's not a job in the same way. There was a problem where online, a lot of these teams, they could go toe-to-toe with 3D, or they could upset you, they could win maps. But when you came to LAN, until you got to the later days of complexity, etc., it was really only your team that ever really showed up against the Europeans, right? For some reason, the NA teams, they never could do it, right?
Well, I won't point to cheating on that one. It's a totally different vibe when you're playing online in the comfort of your own home. You know, you're sitting in your underwear or whatever, and you got a French fry next to you, and you're sitting there playing Counter-Strike, and you're kind of just in your element. When you go to a LAN tournament and there's however many thousands of people out in the arena watching, and there's people hooting and hollering, and there's adrenaline flowing, it's an entirely different beast. So we always just kind of attribute it to that.
So one thing that I found really confusing to this day, even though I know a lot of the people involved and I've talked to them, I still don't really understand what went wrong, was when the 3D success kind of started to fail a bit. Like, here's the thing, the story's weird, because on one hand, at the World Cyber Games, there was great success. You guys actually did very well, etc. I mean, that was slightly after your time, but when you were at the CPLs coming into that phase, like 2003, 2004 sort of era, on paper, your lineup's still really great. I mean, every recruit you made will always be a good player. It'd be like Bombs or, these are Volcano, all good players that are getting recruited. But at the CPLs themselves, you started to get upset and the team started to not go as deep anymore. And there started to be, I know from inside, people were like, right, it's my turn to be the in-game leader now. And we're switching things up. And what happened within 3D? Why did 3D stop being so dominant? Stop being a winning team?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think a lot of that happened after I left 3D. I think the tournament before, like my last tournament, I don't remember where we finished, top 5 or something like that, but nothing crazy. I think people just started getting burned out. It'd be my guess. I mean, that's kind of why I ended up stepping away. Is I just got burned out and wanted to do something different. I don't know. I know after I left that Sal or somebody came in, and a couple players I really didn't know that well. So once I stepped away from 3D, I really didn't keep contact with them. It wasn't like a negative toxic vibe. I had just moved on, so I really don't know.
When you were a pro player, you were one of the few early pros who actually used to purposely release your POV demos. Like if you had a good game, you'd release the Cal match or whatever for everyone. And at the time, it was kind of like, I noticed a lot of the star players, they kind of like almost cultivated their image. Like if K-Sharp released a demo, it'd be like once every 6 months. It'd only be if he went absolutely insane. So then if you watched his demos, he's going to look like the best player ever, In general, you were someone who, it seemed like you were quite early on, you kind of got that. There's fans who want to watch this stuff and actually kind of cultivating fans, whether you're the best player or not, it's a good thing for the brand. And this sort of, were you thinking that way? Well, why were you a community guy early on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like any other pro sport. It's really for the fans. I mean, everything is for the fans. And today with Twitch and YouTube and everything, I think it's even gotten more so. I mean, I love watching a pro player. I don't even know who they are, but I like to see what's going on in the games these days. And plus it keeps them engaged and it helps the sport grow. I mean, it wasn't for fame or anything. It's not like I got anything out of it, but it was just, here's how I play. Go watch and either be entertained or learn from it, or do what you want with it. But I liked releasing demos.
Okay, so like I said, since some of the others who were very, very good, like very rarely released a demo or kept kind of like the mystique around them in that way, when you released all these demos, I have to say, when I first watched them all and I knew you were in the best NA team, you didn't have crazy aim. You weren't the guy who just one bulleted everyone in the head with an AK and you think, well, this guy, it's impossible.
Right.
What was your style of play? What were your strengths?
I like to think that I outsmarted people. If I listen to footsteps and predict where they're coming. I mean, I have decent aim. I still have decent aim, but I succeed in most of my games by research and putting the time in and figuring the ins and outs of games. A lot of, in my opinion, video games can be won just using your head and having decent aim. But I mean, there's some guys out there today that I watch and I'm just like, how is that even possible?
Yeah,
I mean, it's like they're using PEDs or something. And I'm not actually saying they are. Don't get me wrong. But it's amazing. But I can still go into an FPS game. I can do well, but it's certainly not from being able to out aim these kids. It's crazy.
Okay, so this is something that you became known for, was like clutch rounds, okay?
Right.
Playing a style scenario. And I've always said to people, I think this principle's held up to the end of time. Because in a clutch round, both players have like a level of pressure on them, And it becomes like a guessing game of where is the person, what they're going to do. It's not just anymore like 5v5 where you run out, you take a duel, and then, the best aimer could probably win that fight. So my line I always used to say was, it's like in a 1v1, the aim doesn't matter, and it's just about the brain at that point in time. So what decision do you make almost? Because no one's really just going to instantly one bullet you, probably.
Sure. I mean, it's about your surroundings. It's about everything. And clutch is kind of what I guess I became known for back in those days. But I think it was mostly because I wouldn't get too excited, right? I didn't feel a whole lot of pressure in any game that I can remember. It was exciting, but I never felt like everything was relying on me. So I guess that was a good feeling to have because I had good teammates around me, but it's just what my style of play was.
So you actually had a clutch round that is people can see it out in movies. There's actually a CS movie called Clutch that I'm pretty sure it's in, and it was in a tournament where you played against Four Kings, the British team, and it was on Mill. And the key detail is they would win the game. It was match point unless you won a 1v3 with a Desert Eagle. And they had the bomb planted, they were in the site, they were hiding. And if anyone knows the layout of the bomb site Mill, a bomb site, that's the one where it's just loads of boxes that people can be hiding behind. So if you're in a 1v3 in that scenario, you look the wrong way, you're just dead immediately in the back. Do you remember this round? Is it coming back?
Oh, yeah, I remember this round. Yeah, it was a good one. Again, I didn't feel pressure that round. I knew that there was 25 grand on the line or whatever, but I just played, and they actually made the mistakes. I think a couple of them peaked when they didn't need to peak, and though there was a gun or something, a Desert Eagle on the ground that I picked up to finish off the last one and defuse. And I remember that was the only moment where I actually did a fist pump, and I was super excited. Okay. I felt like I just scored the game-winning touchdown. But before that, I was just playing. I mean, I think I said, "Oh shit," like really loud because I thought the game was over. I didn't think there was any chance. But I think they made the mistakes more so than me being clutch. I just took advantage of them. The whole mind game thing, I guess.
Sure, but I mean, that's one of the interesting things about that kind of like people who have that sense, like they're calm, they figure things out, is it's not that many people. It's still a rare quality, I've noticed. Like, it's not about talent, there's a lot of players who are very talented who, for whatever reason, they don't get that. Or sometimes they go the other way. They're very talented, but they're so nervous, that they make, like you're saying, they make a mistake that normally they wouldn't make if it was a normal round.
Sure. And I think a lot of that's confidence, right? I mean, you're playing with a group of guys that you're always winning. Right, winning just breeds confidence, right? So you keep winning, you're like, nobody can stop us, and then everything you're doing is just right. I mean, there's tournaments we used to play where we probably made a lot of mistakes, but because we believed in them, they just worked. Yeah. And I think that's a key in every aspect of life. I mean, if you're confident in what you're going to do, you're probably going to do it better than if you're not, regardless if you have more talent or not.
So there's a lot of players that if they work on their game, their aim gets very good or their skills get very good. And, obviously the people that are easiest to look to is the ones that are very dedicated, A lot of obviously the Europeans were like this, who put in the long hours and land, like you said. Mm-hmm. So what was it actually like to play with K-Sharp then? Because as far as I know, that's not the story with him at all. Like I said, he's another guy. He had all the level 80 characters in World of Warcraft at the same time. He's a pro, This is a guy who it's natural talent, right?
Natural talent. He was definitely a natural talent. He probably still is. He could probably pick up CS and go hit people in the face with AWP all day long. It's just, he just had a gift. I mean, he put the time in, but he basically would get really good at it, and then he'd let talent take over and move on to something else. But, I mean, you can't take anything away from K-Sharp. He's famous for his sniping for a reason.
Was he the most ridiculous one in practice?
Yeah. I mean, we would play some other games. Like we would play, different 1v1 maps, or we would play different versions of Half-Life. I think there was a Quake version, like a
HRDM.
Yeah, I mean, he would. It didn't matter what we picked up. He would just hit you across the map, and you're just like still learning the buttons.
Yeah,
it's just what he was good at. But I mean, he's a good kid too. We had a lot of fun.
Okay, so an interesting kind of, it was like the last phase of your pro career was you went to a team that was called Complexity, and everyone now knows who the name of that team is. They obviously went on to success, but at the time, the key detail is they weren't a big knit team. Actually, it was just Jason Lake was willing to invest money, and you were one of the first players he was getting actually. But before we go to that, I want to just ask this question. So officially, you had actually retired from 3D. I remember you'd retired. It was like 2 or 3 weeks later we heard this story about Complexity. Uh-huh. Did you really 100% retire? Like, as in, did you at the time really think this is the end of my career? Because some people thought, even 3D members, like it was an angle shoot. Like you did it to get out your contract, and then you waited a few weeks, and then you were like, oh, I've come back from my retirement. It was legit.
No, it was 100% legit. I decided that this just wasn't gonna take me anywhere. Of course, looking back on it, I wish I had stayed with it, but no, I was time to be a big boy, and I was like 26 years old. It's time to go get a real job or something, and I had quit, and then it's maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks later, I get this phone call from this random guy. he's telling me, it's Jason Lake, of course, and he's telling me what he's doing and how he wants me on his team and everything. And I'm like, this guy's like a stalker. Who the hell is this?
Yeah.
I had my roommate with me, and I'm like, this guy can't be for real. And Jason's like, because he lived in Atlanta, and I was in Atlanta at the time too. And he's like, I'll pick you up in a car. I'll have a car come pick you up and take me to my place, and we'll talk about contracts. I'm like, this can't be real. But yeah, we went to his house and worked on some numbers and some offers.
Didn't he offer you some he offered you some really ridiculous number? Like, I remember famously, one of the things he bragged about is he was going to give you like a 401k or something, which at the time that was like, is this real?
That was actually made up. No, I think what the offer was a salary and a brand new computer, and I really had my heart set on a motorcycle, and he bought me the damn motorcycle as like a signing bonus.
Fair enough. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, 26-year-old kid, I was like, all right, well, I guess I can keep doing this for a little longer. But no, yeah, he did. I genuinely retired. There was no like shadow games. I'd never even heard of Complexity before I retired, and he just kind of bought me. That's really the only way to say it.
Okay, so the thing is, when he made this team, like as I said, you were the first big name, but he gradually added other like players they were pros. The key thing was none of them were like super duper pros in theory. None of them like you won a CPL, but mainly they were like players that like were didn't fit into a team or didn't have a good team. And so what we eventually found was they all turned out to be like good in different ways, But the one that was interesting was, I know when you were in 3D that actually Fraud was like a rival player. He was someone where a lot of the players in 3D didn't like him, or they thought, I mean, I don't think they literally thought he cheated, but they thought he was like, an onliner, or he's too cocky or something like this,
Right.
And in Complexity was the time where he really emerged as like a star player. What was Fraud like as a teammate?
He was cool. I mean, Fraud was quiet, laid back. He's actually a lot like K-Sharp in both his game style and his personality. They both were very quiet, but certainly knew how good they were. Put it that way. They like to impose their will on the enemy. I guess we'll say it that way. But yeah, he was cool. I mean, he's part Cuban and living down in Miami. He was just laid back, and I think he was like 18 years old maybe, and just, I'm playing video games for a living. I mean, what more could you ask for at 18? But he was good. He's a cool kid.
So your last big tournament of your career basically was with Complexity, and it was this one where the team made a miracle run, because even though they had these players, like I say, we knew some of them, and some of them maybe had potential. I remember, I think you finished I think it was 5th place or something, but at the time, this was when CPLs had gotten really stacked, like 5th, like top 8 then would be like, 6 European teams, maybe 2 NA teams, and this was the one where, again, if people want to go back and check it out, Cole actually had a movie made about it. I think it was Redemption. It was like a documentary about this tournament. Now, at this tournament, you had a bunch of games where you played teams that were like ranked number 1 from Europe, or teams where every time it's like, okay, they did good this far, but they should probably lose now. Was it a miracle run in that sense?
I think I won't call that tournament a miracle run. I mean, we played well. I mean, we knew that we were better than what most people were giving us. We'd been practicing a lot. I actually brought a lot of strats into it. I didn't call the strats, but I helped them with some of the things that I had learned from my years. It's one of those things when you go into a tournament and you start playing, you play your first couple games, and if you're feeling it, you feel like your team can't lose, right? It was the whole confidence thing again. And Complexity had that. I mean, we were walking, before we even got to the tournament, I told Jason, I was like, I believe this team can win this tournament. And we went in with that mindset, and we played really well. I mean, we wanted to do better than we did. But yeah, I mean, everyone was super stoked with how the games were going. I think we beat Mouse Sports, maybe, was a big one. I can't remember. But we just believe it's one of those things. If you believe that you're going to win, like truly believe, not like hoping. Yeah. You're probably going to have success. I mean, if you go in with a lot of doubts, then you're going to lose. It doesn't matter how good you are. And we had worked on it. We put in the time, and it was just a good run. I don't know what they've all done since then. I really haven't been keeping track of that part of the esports scene, but obviously they're still around and they're still in a whole bunch of games. So I'm assuming things have worked out for them.
So this is the bizarre thing, though. Like, that was the big breakout for Complexity as a CS team. They're making this big finish, and Fraud, emerges like a star player, and everyone's like, right, let's see what happens next year.
Yeah.
And this is the bizarre thing, because remember, the story was when they signed Bullseye, he's the marquee name, He's going to attract the other players, and we're going to build around him. He's an experienced player. So why did you step away then? Why did you stop being a member of this team quite soon after?
Kind of the same reasons I stepped away from 3D. I was just getting older, and I wanted to do something different. I mean, esports had quite a few years where, at least on the Counter-Strike scene, it had stalled. Right? I mean, there were still a couple tournaments every year, but it's certainly not anything like it is today. So I didn't know how long I could keep holding on to that and hoping that it would kind of boom. And plus, my game had started fading. I probably stopped putting in the time just because I was getting burned out. So I was just ready to move on to something different.
When you say that, like, a couple of these years, obviously from 3D and then Call, you thought to yourself, right, it's stalled. That's a great way to describe it. The scene's kind of stalled. It's the same place and it's not getting bigger. If anything, maybe it gets a little bit smaller or it stays around the same place. Mm-hmm. Like, that's obvious to me as to why it's reasonable as someone gets to your age at the time. Like you said, you were 26, 27. Why you might think, right, maybe I've had my career. It was fun. I got to be a pro for it. Maybe it's time to go away.
Right.
Like, now, everyone would be like, oh, well, yeah, definitely stay in it. It gets really big later on. But a lot of people will now claim they always knew it was going to. You couldn't really know at that time, could you, that it was going to get this big?
Oh, no. I never would have dreamed that it is what it is today, where there's tournaments on that you can watch on your TV at any time, and it's ESPN writes articles about it, and it's on TBS, and they're talking about having pro teams per city over here, and
Sure.
I think colleges are now offering tuitions to come play video games for their Heroes of the Storm team or whatever. It's crazy. It's ridiculously crazy, but it's awesome. It is totally awesome. It's fun to watch.
If someone is actually becoming a pro now, obviously, like you were in a very different set of circumstances, but normally people just give the advice of like, practice a lot, like, work on your skills, be a good teammate, blah, blah, blah. What advice would you give in terms of the fact that you have to kind of go all in to some degree at some point?
Yeah. I mean, putting the time and putting in the practice is obviously required, but I think a lot of it, at least from my experiences, is getting, if you're going to play a team-based game, for sure, surrounding yourself with the right people. I don't really know all the politics and everything involved today, but if you can get just really good with 5 of your friends or whatever, go do it that way. But I think what people have to understand, even back then and certainly probably now, is it's the 1%ers that make it big. It's not something just anyone can go do. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of practice, but it also takes a lot of luck. I was very, very fortunate to ever be able to play for money and succeed at it. But I mean, I tell anyone if they want to go for it, then go for it. It's certainly the time. I mean, it's what, $1 billion industry or something like that right now. It's crazy.
Okay, I've got a few kind of like quick fire questions. So just one-offs, and tell me what comes to mind when I say it. Okay.
Okay.
Who was the most skilled teammate you ever had?
K-Sharp.
Okay. Is there a reason why?
Just from pure skill, his aim, K-Sharp.
Okay. And who was the most skilled player you played against? Like, who was the guy you held as like, this guy's unreal,
Oh man. What was Potty's teammate, the big name teammate
Heaton.
from NIP? Heaton. I would say Heaton. That guy was ridiculous.
Okay, who was the smartest teammate you ever played with?
Other than myself? No.
Okay.
Probably Moto.
Okay. Any reason, anything that comes to mind?
Just he would think outside the box. I mean, we would go into practices and he'd come up with some brand new thing that none of us had even seen, and it would work. So he was very good at coming up with new tactics.
Okay. Who was the smartest opponent you think you played against? Who's the guy who impressed you?
I'd have to say Potty. I would have to say Potty.
Okay. What about, is there was obviously in the NA scene you did get to play with a lot of the good players, or they eventually were in teams that you were in. Was there ever a player where you never got the chance to play with them in a team, but you always thought like, this guy's a really good player, or I'd just love to play with him, or what would it be like? Is there someone who didn't make, it just the lines were crossed, when it could have happened?
I can't really say yes to that one because I got to play with all the people I wanted to play with.
Okay.
From the NA scene, I mean, I don't consider myself or even our teams better than anyone that was in America, but our rivals were always the Europeans, right? So we would take all our North American games almost as practice just to get to that point, right? I can't really think of a single NA game that I personally was like, oh, I can't wait to play them. I want to beat them, or they were just practice in my mind.
Sure. In the early days, when you like I said, if you really had the best lineup and you were the best individual players, you could win almost no matter what. Mm-hmm. I noticed in your teams, as the years went on, was there like a factor where eventually people had to accept within the team that, a young player who once was just an onliner or once was just like, an okay player was as good as you? Like there's evolution there. Because I know famously, I was quite good friends with Moto, and he was a guy who had real big problems with this. Like it's one thing if someone just comes up and they kind of beating you, and you might be like, well, it seems bullshit. But he's a guy where it would take him like 3 or 4 years before he admit that actually that guy is really good. Before that, he had every excuse. Oh, he low ping, and he's just an online-er, and he's maybe he cheats. He had every excuse. Did it take a while as a group when you'd been on top for so long to be able to accept that other people are going to rise up?
Not for me personally. I know people are better than me, so it's all right.
Okay.
But I think when we would lose, for me personally, my thing was let's get better. Let's do better than what we just did, so we can be the best again. There wasn't ever an excuse thing for me. It was just I want to beat them. Losing sucks. I mean, it sucks for everyone in different ways. But as far as like putting the blame on some outside thing, that's not really me.
So I remember a long time ago reading an interview where you actually said, because like I said, in the really early days, there was maybe like 2 CPLs a year if you're a North American team. And so actually, even the online leagues in the early days, that was still something to do, something to win, someone to try competing. I remember you saying that like when you won a season of Cal Invite in the early days, you like went on Ventrilo. Well, it wouldn't have been Ventrilo, it'd been something else back then, like Roger, whatever that one was called.
Yeah.
And you all like sang like We Are the Champions by Queen, so it sounds pretty cheesy, but do you feel like you were there at the beginning of esports?
I do, especially for team esports. I mean, I know Doom and Quake and all that had their champions, but as far as bringing a team esport into the limelight, I think that the early Counter-Strikers are probably the pioneers. Okay.
Right. At the end of the interview, do you have like a final message for people or someone you want to shout out to, say hello to?
Shout out to anyone who remembers me, I guess. No, if y'all want to catch more of me, I'll be on Twitch. I'm going to start doing
Twitch?
It's twitch.tv/Bullseye Morgan.
Okay.
And I'll be starting to do regular streams. Hope it takes off, but if not, I'll be streaming anyway. Y'all come say hi.
Hi, this is Natu, a guy who's way too old and way too long involved in this game, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.